The night I saved him, I didn't know I had just signed my life away. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that blurred streetlights into trembling halos and turned every sound into something distant and hollow. And I remember thinking how quiet the city felt at 2:13 a.m. Like even New York needed a moment to breathe. And I was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that made my hands shake as I fumbled for my keys in the empty parking lot outside the clinic, my sneakers soaked through, my hoodie clinging to my skin, every step heavier than the last after. A 14-hour shift that had stretched into something longer because I couldn't leave when people still needed help. That was always my problem. I always stayed, and maybe that's why I didn't walk away when I should have, because I heard it before I saw him, a soft, uneven sound against the concrete, like someone trying not to be heard, and my first instinct was to freeze, my second was to look, and that was the moment everything changed. He was leaning against the side of a black SUV that looked too expensive to belong in a place like this, his head slightly bowed, dark hair damp from the rain, his shirt clinging to him like it had been tailored to fit every line of his body. And even in that dim, flickering light, I could tell he didn't belong to my world. He was too composed, too still, like the storm bent around him instead of touching him. And when his eyes lifted to meet mine, something in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate. Like my instincts were trying to tell me something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. You're hurt, I said, because that was what I did. I noticed things, I stepped closer even when I shouldn't, even when every late-night safety rule I'd ever learned told me to get back in my car and drive away. But he didn't answer right away, he just watched me, like he was studying me, like I was the unexpected variable in a situation he had already calculated. And I hated that. It made me nervous, hated that. It made me feel seen in a way I wasn't prepared for. It's nothing, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And I shook my head because I knew better than to believe that. I stepped closer, close enough to notice the tension in his posture, the way his hand pressed lightly against his side like he was holding something together. And I didn't ask permission. I never did in moments like that. I just reached into my bag for the small kit I always carried. The one I told myself was just for work, but somehow always followed me home. Hold still, I whispered, because that's what you say when someone is on the edge of losing control. And for a second, just 1 second, I thought he might refuse, but he didn't. He let me step into his space, let me adjust the fabric of his shirt just enough to see what I needed to see. And I worked quickly, efficiently, the way I had been trained, focusing on the task, because it was easier than thinking about the man in front of me. About the way the air felt heavier around him, about the black SUV with tinted windows that reflected nothing back, about the quiet that didn't feel empty anymore but watched. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said suddenly, and I almost laughed because the irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my voice steady. Neither should you. And that was when something shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed that neither of us could uncross. And when I finally stepped back, when I finally let myself look at him, without the excuse of helping, I realized something that made my pulse stutter. He wasn't just some stranger caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was something else entirely, something bigger, and I had just walked straight into his world without even knowing it. Why did you help me? He asked, his gaze locking onto mine in a way that made it impossible to look away, and I blinked, confused by the question because the answer felt so obvious. Because you needed it, I said simply, and for a moment, the storm seemed to quiet, like the city itself was waiting. And then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, like he had just confirmed something to himself, something I didn't understand yet. Something I wouldn't understand until much later, when it was already too late. No, he said softly, almost to himself. That wasn't kindness. And the way he looked at me then, the certainty in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. That was fate. He did not say anything else after that, and somehow that silence felt heavier than the storm, like the air itself had shifted into something I could not name, something I should have walked away from. But I did not. I just stood there with my hands still slightly raised, like I had forgotten how to exist outside the moment. And then headlights cut through the rain, bright and sudden, forcing me to blink as another black car pulled into the lot, smooth and deliberate, stopping a few feet behind him. the doors opening almost at the same time. Two men stepping out in dark coats that fit too perfectly to be ordinary. Their movements precise, controlled, and for the first time that night, I felt it clearly, that quiet warning in my chest that I had stepped into something far bigger than a stranger in the rain. They did not look at me at first. Their attention went straight to him, and the shift in their posture was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Respect, not casual, not polite, but something deeper, something earned or feared. "Sir," one of them said, his voice low, careful, like even a single word needed to be measured, and I felt my stomach drop, because people did not speak like that unless the person in front of them demanded it without asking. I took a small step back, instinct finally catching up with me, my fingers curling around the strap of my bag as if it could anchor me to something normal, something safe, but it was already too late for that. His gaze returned. To me, steady and unreadable, like he had already decided something I had not agreed to, and it made my pulse quicken in a way I did not understand. "You should go," he said, and for a second I thought I heard something softer underneath it, something almost protective, but I could not be sure, not when everything about him contradicted that idea. "Right," I said quickly, nodding like that was the most reasonable thing in the world, like I had not just crossed some invisible line. I turned toward my car, my steps faster now, the rain soaking through everything as I fumbled with my keys again, dropping them once before finally managing to unlock the door, and I told myself not to look back, not to turn around, not to get pulled into whatever this was, but I did anyway, just once, and he was still there, standing exactly where I left him, watching me, not the men beside him, not the car, just me, like I was the only thing in that moment that mattered. And it made my breath catch before I forced myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I started the engine, the sound too loud in the quiet lot. Too real. I pulled out faster than I should have, my tires slipping slightly on the wet pavement before catching, and I did not slow down until the clinic was out of sight, until the black cars were gone, until I could convince myself that none of it had been real, that he had just been another stranger, that I had done what I always did, and then walked away. But the city did not feel the same on the drive home. Every light seemed sharper, every shadow deeper, and I could not shake the feeling that something had followed me, not physically, not in a way I could prove, but in a way that settled under my skin, quiet and persistent, like a question I had not answered. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had started to lighten just enough to blur the edges of night, and I told myself I was safe, that whatever that moment had been, it was over. I climbed the stairs, unlocked my door, stepped inside, and leaned back against it with a slow breath, my heartbeat finally beginning to steady. But then I noticed it, something small, something that should not have been there, resting on the floor just inside my apartment. A simple black envelope with no name, no marking, nothing but my address written in clean, precise handwriting, and the moment I picked it up, the weight of it too deliberate to be accidental, I understood something that made my chest tighten all over again. I had not walked away from that night, not really, and whatever he had meant when he said fate, it had already started. I did not open the envelope right away because something about it felt intentional in a way that made my instincts tighten, like it had not just been delivered but placed, chosen, and I stood there in the dim light of my apartment entryway with rain still dripping from my hair onto the hardwood floor, staring at it like it might disappear if I waited long enough. But it did not. It stayed exactly where it was, silent and patient, and eventually curiosity won over caution the way it always did. With me, I slipped my finger under the edge and opened it carefully, half expecting something complicated, something threatening, something that would confirm everything I was trying not to think about. But inside there was only a single card, thick black paper, expensive, the kind you did not pick up at a corner store. And on it, in the same precise handwriting, were just a few words, no explanation, no signature, just a time and an address, nothing more, and somehow that was worse, because it meant whoever had sent it assumed I would understand, assumed I would come, assumed I was already part of something I had never agreed to. No, I whispered to myself, shaking my head as I set the card down on the small table by the door, because that was the only reasonable response. I did not know him. I did not belong in his world, and whatever that night had been, it did not mean anything beyond a moment. A coincidence, something I could choose to forget if I tried hard enough. I locked the door, checked it twice, then moved through my apartment on autopilot, peeling off my damp hoodie, grabbing a towel, trying to wash the night away in routines that had always grounded me before. But it did not work this time, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again. The way he had looked at me, not like a stranger, not like someone passing through, but like someone who had found something he had been searching for, and it made no sense. None of it did. I barely slept, and when morning came, it felt like I had not rested at all, just existed in a loop of thoughts I could not shut off. I went to work anyway because that was what I did. I showed up. I kept moving. I focused on the things I could control: patients, charts, schedules, real problems with clear solutions. But even there, something was off. Small things at first. The front desk receptionist giving me a strange look like she wanted to say something but decided not to. The security guard nodding at me with a level of attention I had never received before, like I had suddenly become someone worth noticing. And I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting the unease from last night onto everything else, until my shift ended and I stepped outside into the late afternoon light and saw the car, the same black SUV parked across the street, not hidden, not subtle, just there, like it had every right to be, and my breath caught before I could stop it, my feet slowing without permission, because deep down I already knew what it meant. This was not over. It had never been over. And as I stood there trying to decide whether to turn around and go back inside or pretend I had not seen it, the passenger door opened, smooth and quiet, and one of the men from last night stepped out, his posture as controlled as before, his gaze finding mine instantly. "Miss Hayes," he said, like he had known me for years, like my name had always belonged to him. "Mr. Wolf would like to see you." And for a second, just 1 second, I considered saying no, considered walking away and pretending none of this existed. But then I thought about the envelope, the card, the way everything had already unfolded without my permission, and I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. This was not a request, not really. It was an invitation wrapped in certainty, and somehow, without understanding why, I took a step forward. I should have walked away, but instead I crossed the street with a strange calm settling over me. The kind that comes when a decision is already made somewhere deeper than logic. And the man held the door open without another word, his expression neutral, practiced, like this was routine for him, like people stepped into cars like this every day and did not question it. And that thought alone should have stopped me, but it did not. I slid into the passenger seat, and the door closed behind me with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten. The interior was warm, silent, the faint scent of leather and something expensive lingering in the air, and the world outside seemed to dull instantly as the tinted windows separated me from everything familiar. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into traffic like it belonged there, like it owned the road, and no one spoke for the first few minutes. Not the driver, not the man beside me, not me, because I was trying to keep my thoughts steady, trying to hold on to something rational, something that explained why I was here instead of back on the sidewalk pretending none of this existed. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended, and the man beside me glanced at me briefly before looking forward again. "You will see," he said, and I almost laughed at that because it sounded like something out of a movie, something scripted and distant, but nothing about this felt distant. It felt too real, too immediate. And the city outside blurred past in familiar shapes that slowly became unfamiliar as we moved further away from my routine, from my life, until the buildings grew taller, cleaner, more polished, the streets quieter, more controlled, and I realized we were heading somewhere I had never been before, somewhere I had only seen from a distance. The car eventually turned into a private drive, the gates already opening before we reached them, and that was when it hit me fully. This was not just money. This was power, the kind that did not wait, the kind that moved ahead of you, and I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly against my jeans as we came to a stop in front of a building that rose into the sky, like it had been designed to remind people exactly who belonged inside and who did not. The door opened again, and I stepped out slowly, my eyes lifting to take it in, glass and steel and silence, everything sharp and intentional. And for a second I felt small in a way I had not expected. Not weak, but out of place, like I had stepped into someone else's story without permission. "This way," the man said, and I followed because at this point there was nothing else to do. We moved through the lobby where everything gleamed under soft lighting. The floors spotless, the air quiet, no crowd, no noise, just space, controlled and deliberate, and no one stopped us. No one questioned why I was there in my worn sneakers and simple jacket, because they were not looking at me. They were looking at him, at the man leading me, and whatever they saw was enough to let us pass without hesitation. The elevator ride was silent, the kind that stretched just long enough to make you aware of every breath, every second, until the doors opened again onto a floor that felt even more removed from reality, private, secluded. And when we stepped out, I saw him immediately, standing near the window that overlooked the city, his back to me, his posture as composed as it had been the night before, like nothing ever touched him unless he allowed it to. "You came," he said without turning, his voice calm, certain, like he had never doubted it for a second, and I frowned slightly because that assumption unsettled me more than anything else. "You sent a car," I replied, my tone steadier now, grounding myself in something simple, something factual, and that was when he turned, slowly, deliberately, his gaze finding mine with that same intensity that had stayed with me all night. And for a moment, everything else faded again. The building, the city, the distance between us, it all disappeared under the weight of that look. "I sent an invitation," he said, stepping closer, each movement controlled, measured, like he had all the time in the world. "You chose to accept it." And I opened my mouth to argue, to say something that put distance back between us, but the words caught because part of me knew he was right, and that realization unsettled me in a way I could not explain. "Why am I here?" I asked instead, because that was the question that mattered, the only one I needed answered. And his expression shifted just slightly, not softer, not kinder, but something more focused, more certain. "Because you stepped into my life last night," he said, his voice lowering just enough to make it feel personal, intentional. "And I do not ignore things that matter." And the way he said it made my pulse quicken again, because I had the distinct feeling he was not talking about the moment. Not really, he was talking about me. And I was not sure if that was something I should be afraid of or something I had already become part of without realizing it. I should have said something stronger, something that pushed him back into whatever world he came from. But instead I held his gaze longer than I meant to, trying to understand what kind of man stood in front of me and spoke about people like they were decisions, like they were pieces on a board he already knew how to move. And it unsettled me more than anything else. "You do not get to decide what matters to me," I said finally, my voice steady even though my pulse was not. And for a second, the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to recognition that it made my breath catch, like I had just done something unexpected, something he did not see often. "No," he agreed quietly, taking another step closer, closing the distance just enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us. "But I decide what enters my world." And the way he said it was not a threat, not exactly. It was a statement, calm and certain, like gravity, like something that did not need to be explained to exist. And I hated that it made me hesitate, hated that part of me wanted to understand it instead of rejecting it outright. "I helped you," I said, grounding myself in something simple again, something real. "That is all that happened." And his eyes did not leave mine as I spoke, did not soften, did not change, but there was something there now, something deeper, more focused. "That is not all that happened," he replied, and the certainty in his voice made my stomach tighten. "You saw me when I was not meant to be seen." And that sentence should have scared me more than it did, but instead it confused me, because I did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet. "I saw a man who needed help," I said, shaking my head slightly. "That does not make this anything more than it was." And for the first time since I walked into that room, he paused, just for a second, like he was considering something, like he was deciding how much to say. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not softer, but more deliberate. "People do not help me without expecting something in return," he said. And there was something in that statement that felt heavier than the words themselves. Something that hinted at a life I could not see, could not understand. I was not expecting anything. I answered immediately, because that part was true. It had been instinct, nothing more, nothing less. And his gaze held mine for a long moment before he nodded once, slow, thoughtful, like he was filing that answer away somewhere important. Exactly, he said, and that single word landed in a way I could not explain. Like it confirmed something for him, something I was not part of yet. That is why you are here. And I exhaled slowly, trying to process that, trying to find the logic in it. But there was none, not in the way I understood the world. You brought me here because I did not ask for anything, I repeated, disbelief slipping into my voice despite my effort to stay calm. And this time he did allow a faint smile, brief and controlled, but real. I brought you here because you are different, he said. And the word different should not have meant anything. It should have been easy to dismiss. But the way he said it made it feel like a fact, not an opinion, like something already proven. And I crossed my arms slightly, creating a barrier, something physical to hold on to. I am not part of your world, I said, more firmly now, and I am not interested in becoming part of it. And for a moment, silence settled between us again, heavier this time, more intentional, and then he nodded, like he had expected that answer too, like it was already part of whatever plan he was building in his mind. You are right, he said, his tone calm, almost agreeable, and that threw me off more than if he had argued, more than if he had pushed back, because it meant he was not trying to convince me. Not yet. You are not part of my world, he continued, his gaze steady, unwavering. But my world has already noticed you. And something in my chest tightened at that, something sharp and immediate, because that sentence felt like a shift, like a line I could not see but had just crossed. What does that mean? I asked, my voice quieter now, not out of fear but out of focus. Because suddenly this felt less like a conversation and more like a warning I did not fully understand. And he held my gaze for another second before answering, his voice low, controlled, and certain. It means walking away will not be as simple as you think. And for the first time since I stepped into that building, I felt it clearly, not just curiosity, not just confusion, but the unmistakable realization that whatever had started that night was not something I could end on my own terms. His words stayed with me longer than I expected, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were calm, certain, like something already set in motion, and I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest as I stood there trying to find a response that did not sound like I had already lost control of the situation. I decide when I walk away, I said finally, forcing the words out with more confidence than I felt, because I needed that to be true, needed something in this moment to still belong to me. And for a second, just 1 second, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, not irritation, not resistance, but interest, like I had just confirmed something he was testing. Then walk, he said simply, stepping aside just enough to clear the space between me and the door, and the ease of it caught me off guard, because I had expected resistance, expected pressure, expected him to close the distance instead of opening it. And now that he had given me the option, I realized something uncomfortable. I was hesitating, not because I was afraid of him, but because I did not fully understand what leaving would actually change, and that realization unsettled me more than anything he had said so far. I moved anyway, 1 step, then another, my heartbeat steady but louder than it should have been. The door only a few feet away, freedom simple and within reach, and I told myself this was the right decision, that whatever world he existed in had nothing to do with me, that I could walk out and everything would return to normal. But just as my hand reached for the handle, his voice stopped me, quiet, controlled. Olivia, he said, and hearing my name from him again did something I could not explain, something that made me pause without thinking, and I turned back slowly, already, knowing that I should not have. You are careful with everyone else, he continued, his gaze steady, focused entirely on me. But you were not careful with me. And I frowned slightly, confusion slipping through despite my effort to stay composed. I helped you, I said again, because that was still the only explanation that made sense to me, the only one I could hold on to. And he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. You stepped closer, he corrected quietly. You stayed when your instincts told you to leave. And the accuracy of that statement made something tighten in my chest, because he was right. I had ignored the warning signs, I had chosen to stay, and now I was standing here trying to pretend that choice did not matter. That does not change anything, I replied, but my voice was softer now, less certain, and he took a step forward again, closing the distance just slightly, not enough to trap me. Just enough to remind me that he was still there, still present, still watching. It changes everything, he said, and the weight of that sentence settled between us, heavier than before, because this time it did not sound like a possibility, it sounded like a fact, and I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the door handle as I tried to hold on to my decision, tried to move forward instead of getting pulled back into whatever this was. But then he spoke again, and this time his voice was different, not softer, not weaker, but more direct, more personal. "If you leave now," he said, "I will not stop you." And for a brief moment, relief flickered through me, sharp and immediate, but it did not last, because he continued before I could act on it. "But I will not stop the consequences either." And that was when everything shifted again. The air, the moment, the understanding of what this really was, not a conversation, not an invitation, but a crossroads I had already stepped into. And I felt my breath catch as I turned back toward him fully, my mind racing through possibilities I could not see clearly. "What consequences?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed to understand, needed something solid in a situation that kept slipping through my hands. And he held my gaze for a long second before answering, his tone calm, unwavering. "The ones that come with being noticed." And that word again, noticed, landed differently this time. Heavier, more real, and I realized then that this was not about him alone, not about one man and one moment. It was about everything connected to him, everything I could not see but was already part of his world. And for the first time since this began, I hesitated. Not because I did not know what to do, but because I was starting to understand that whatever choice I made next would not just change my life, it would define it. The word lingered between us longer than it should have. Noticed, simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper that I could feel even if I could not fully define it. And for the first time since I stepped into that building, I realized I was not just deciding whether to leave or stay. I was deciding whether to pretend this had never happened or to face whatever it meant head on. And that thought settled into something steady inside me, something that replaced the confusion with clarity. "Then explain it," I said, letting go of the door handle completely as I turned back toward him, my voice firmer now, grounded in a decision I had not realized I was making until this moment, and his gaze sharpened slightly, not in surprise but in recognition, like he had been waiting to see which direction I would choose. "You want answers," he said, more observation than question, and I nodded once, because that was the only way forward that made sense anymore. "I want the truth," I replied, and something about that seemed to settle. Something in him, something quiet and final. He moved past me then, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air again, controlled, deliberate, and he gestured slightly toward the window overlooking the city. "Come here," he said, and I hesitated for only a second before following, because if I was going to understand this, I needed to see it from his perspective, needed to understand what kind of world created a man like him. We stood side by side, not touching, just looking out over the skyline stretching for miles, lights flickering on as evening settled in, the city alive in a way that felt completely different from this height, distant, almost quiet. "Everything you see," he said slowly, his voice low but clear, "runs on structure, on decisions, on control." And I frowned slightly, trying to follow where he was going, because it sounded abstract, distant from what we were actually talking about. But something told me it was not. Most people live inside it without ever noticing, he continued. They go to work, they go home, they believe they are safe because they follow the rules. And I crossed my arms slightly, more out of habit than defense this time. "And you do not follow those rules," I said, glancing at him briefly, and he met my gaze for a second before looking back out at the city. "I create them," he replied, and there was no arrogance in his tone, no need to prove anything, just certainty, and that certainty was what made it real, what made it impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or ego. I exhaled slowly, trying to process that, trying to reconcile the man I had helped in the rain with the one standing beside me now. "And because I helped you," I said carefully, "I am part of that now." And this time he nodded, once, simple and direct. "You were seen with me," he said. "You approached me, you stayed. You made yourself visible in a moment that was not meant to be shared." And the weight of that settled in my chest differently now, more concrete, less abstract, because I could finally see the connection, finally understand why this was not something I could just walk away from. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice quieter but steadier, because fear had shifted into something else, something closer to resolve. And he turned toward me fully this time, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper, more personal. "Now you decide how you exist within it," he said, and I shook my head slightly. A small, almost disbelieving motion. "That does not sound like a real choice," I replied, and for the first time since I met him, something almost human flickered through his expression, brief but unmistakable. "It is the only kind that matters," he said, and I held his gaze, searching for something in it, something that told me whether this was a warning or an opportunity, whether he was protecting me or pulling me deeper into something I could not control. And I realized then that it was both, that whatever this was, whatever had started that night, it was not just about him or me anymore. It was about the intersection of two worlds that were never meant to meet, and the choice I thought I had was not about leaving. It was about whether I would face what came next or pretend I could outrun it. And standing there, looking out over a city that suddenly felt very different than it had just a day ago, I understood something I could not ignore anymore. I was already in it, whether I wanted to be or not. I did not realize how quiet it had become until the sound of my own breathing felt too loud in the space between us, like the city outside had faded into something distant and unreal, and all that remained was the weight of what he had just said and the certainty behind it. And I tried to hold on to something solid, something familiar, but there was nothing here that belonged to my world anymore. "So what you were saying," I began slowly, choosing each word carefully, "is that helping you once changed everything?" And he did not hesitate, did not soften it. "Yes," he said, and that single word settled in a way that made it impossible to ignore, because there was no room for doubt in it, no space to pretend this was something smaller, something I could still walk away from without consequence. I turned back to the window for a second, my gaze drifting over the streets far below. People moving, cars passing, lives continuing as if nothing had shifted, as if I was not standing here trying to understand how one moment had altered the direction of everything. "That does not seem fair," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, because fairness had always been something I believed in, something I worked toward, and this felt like the opposite of that. And when I looked back at him, I saw it again, that brief flicker of something almost human, something that did not quite fit with the rest of him. "It is not," he admitted, and the honesty in that answer caught me off guard, because I had expected justification, not acknowledgement. "Then why not fix it?" I asked, stepping closer without thinking, drawn into the conversation in a way I had not planned. "Why not just let it end here?" And for a moment, he was silent, his gaze steady on mine, like he was measuring something I could not see. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate than before. "Because I do not undo things that matter," he said, and that word again, matter, carried a weight that made my chest tighten, because I was starting to understand what he meant by it, starting to see that this was not about the situation anymore. It was about how he saw the world, how he defined value, and somehow I had been placed inside that definition without asking for it. "You keep saying that," I said, my voice softer now, less defensive, more focused, like this is not about what happened, but about what you think it means. And this time, he did not look away, did not deflect. "It is about both," he replied. "But what it means is what decides what happens next." And I exhaled slowly, trying to keep up with that, trying to find my footing in a conversation that kept shifting beneath me. "And what happens next?" I asked, because that was the part that mattered now, not the past, not the explanation, but the future I was being pulled into. And he took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, controlled. "That depends on you," he said, and I almost laughed at that, a quiet, disbelieving sound that escaped before I could stop it. "You said that before," I replied, shaking my head slightly. "But it does not feel like a real choice." And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, something more focused, more certain. "It is real," he said, "just not simple." And I held his gaze, searching for something in it, something that told me whether this was a warning or an opportunity, whether he was protecting me or pulling me deeper. And I realized again that it was both, that everything about This situation existed in that space between two truths, and that was what made it impossible to define clearly. If I stay, I said slowly, I become part of your world. And he nodded once, yes. And the certainty in that answer made my pulse quicken again, because there was no hesitation, no doubt. And if I walk away, I continued, I still deal with the consequences of being noticed. And again, that same calm nod. Yes. And for a moment, silence settled between us, heavier than before. Because now everything had been laid out clearly. There were no illusions left, no misunderstandings to hide behind. Just two paths that both led somewhere I had never intended to go. And I realized then that this was the moment, the one that would define everything after it. The one where I either stepped forward into something unknown or tried to hold on to a version of my life that no longer existed. And as I stood there, looking at him, at the man who had turned one act of kindness into something far bigger than I could have imagined, I understood something I could not ignore anymore. Whatever choice I made next, it would not just change my life, it would change who I was inside it. The silence that followed felt different this time, not uncertain, not fragile, but final in a way that made everything inside me settle into something clearer, something steadier, and I realized I was no longer standing between two choices. I was standing in the aftermath of a moment that had already changed me, and the only thing left was deciding who I would be inside it. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of everything he had said sink in fully, not resisting it, not trying to simplify it into something easier to understand, because it was not simple. It was never going to be simple again. You keep talking about choices, I said quietly, meeting his gaze without hesitation now. But the truth is, you already made one for me the moment you decided I mattered. And something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like I had stepped into his world not just physically, but in understanding. And for the first time, it felt like we were standing on the same level of awareness. I recognized something, he corrected calmly, but there was no denial in his voice, only precision, and I nodded slightly because I understood the difference now, or at least part of it. And now I have to decide what to do with that. I continued, more to myself than to him, because the realization felt personal, grounded in something deeper than the situation itself. I turned away from the window again, the city no longer distant but present, alive in a way that mirrored the shift happening inside me. I am not afraid of your world, I said after a moment, my voice steady, not defiant, not reckless, just honest. And that honesty felt stronger than anything else I had said so far. But I am not going to be controlled by it either. And the words settled between us with a quiet certainty that surprised even me, because they were not a reaction, they were a decision. And he watched me closely, his gaze sharp, focused, like he was measuring not just what I said, but what I meant beneath it. And then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Good, he said, and that single word carried something unexpected, not approval exactly, but acceptance, like he had been waiting to see if I would stand my ground instead of stepping back. And that realization shifted something else inside me, something that felt less like being pulled into his world and more like stepping into it on my own terms. Then here is my choice, I said, holding his gaze, making sure there was no misunderstanding in what came next. I am not running. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, the shift, not outside, not in the room, but inside me, like something had locked into place, something that made everything before it feel like preparation for this exact second. But I am not yours either, I added, because that mattered just as much, because if I was stepping forward, it would be as myself, not as something defined by him or his world. And for a second, the air between us held that statement, tested it, measured it, and then he moved, just one step closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to make the moment feel intentional. We will see, he said quietly, and there was no challenge in his voice, no dismissal, just certainty, like he believed time would answer that question in a way neither of us could yet define. And I should have felt uncertain, should have felt overwhelmed by everything that still did not make sense, but instead I felt something else, something stronger, something grounded in the decision I had just made, because I finally understood what this was, not a trap, not a mistake, but a turning point, and whether it led somewhere dangerous or something I could not yet see, it was mine now. And as I stood there, looking at the man who had turned one simple act into something that would reshape everything. I realized something that settled deep and quiet inside me. I had not just stepped into his world that night. I had stepped into a version of myself I had never known before, and there was no going back from that.